Sometimes I think one of the biggest misunderstandings about men is that we believe that we're simple. We believe we're simple emotionally, psychologically, relationally. But what if we're not as simple as the world tells us we are and we're led to believe? What if many men have just spent their lives kind of compressing themselves into a version of masculinity that feels survivable and not necessarily flourishing? A version that's probably shaped early in our lives on playgrounds, in locker rooms, the movies that we watch, the jokes that we tell and are told to us. In all of these quiet ways and not so quiet ways, boys learn that there are parts of themselves that earn acceptance and parts that don't. Be tough, want sex, don't be weak, don't be that guy. And over time, something happens subtly in a man's mind. What begins as adaptation transforms into identity, and the performance slowly hardens a man into a personality that he might not even be able to recognize. So today, I want to explore these concepts about what happens when the version of masculinity that a man learns to survive with becomes too small for him to live fully inside. And there's probably no better guest for me to have today than psychologist and author Andrew Smiler. He has spent decades exploring the hidden complexity of boys and men and why so many of us feel flattened by the roles that we are taught to play and accept as part of our identity. I'm Richard D'Ambrosio, and this is Mindful Masculinity. Today, we're going to learn from Andrew Smiler. He holds a PhD. He's an expert on issues related to boys, men, and masculinity. He has been a speaker, an author. He is a licensed therapist. He's authored 5 books about men and men's lives, including a textbook, books with titles like Clinical Work with Men, Understanding Masculinity in Psychotherapy, and the award-winning Dating and Sex, a guide for the 21st century teen boy. Dr. Smiler is also the lead author of this best-selling textbook, The Masculine Self, which is in its 7th edition. He is also the author of more than 20 peer-reviewed academic articles. His academic research focuses on 2 key issues: the definitions of masculinity and the normative aspects of male dating and sexual development. Not only is he an accomplished speaker and author, but Dr. Smiler is also past president of the Society for the Psychology of Men and Masculinities. He has served as the chair of their Communications and Media Committee. He's co-founder and co-chair of the task force on boys in school. Andrew, thank you so much for taking time out of what I know is a very busy life. It is a pleasure to finally have you to talk about some of these very critical issues.
Thanks, Rich. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So one of the things that in getting to know you, I wonder how much of what you do today is also part of your personality based on the life you lived. You've had quite an interesting life. I understand that you are the son of a single mom.
I am. I'm the youngest son. I'm the youngest child of a single mom. She was a single mom and twice divorced in the 70s. So kind of cutting edge, although perhaps not so much in a good way. So my sister and brother are about a decade older than me. They're from my mom's first marriage. I was from the second marriage, which also gives me the unusual experience. I don't think it's that unique of being both the youngest child and being an only child with that age gap. My sister and brother were both out of the house by the time I was 10. It was just my mom and I. And then the man I call my stepfather, although they never got married, was certainly part of my life by the time I was about 12. So in lots of ways, he is the one who kind of taught me what it looks like to be a man.
What was your experience in your household growing up, at school, in sports, that may have shaped what you saw as the aspirations for being a man and what masculinity stood for?
Sure, that's a great question. So, for a little context here, I am a child of the 80s. I graduated high school in 86. So, I know that puts you and I in about the same group here,
Yep.
um, which I know now, like historically and having done my research, is a bit of a transitional era. Um, but at the time, Larry, who I identify as my stepfather, um, he was very quiet. He was in the background. He facilitated a lot of my mom's life and by extension, my life. But he was never someone who really kind of sought the spotlight. In fact, there was a running joke among all of us that getting a picture of Larry at whatever party my mom was throwing was a real accomplishment. My mom loved to host. She loved to have big parties, whether it was holiday stuff or whatever excuse she needed that week. And Larry was always in the kitchen. Like Larry just kind of facilitated the party. And so at some point, and this is the day of film cameras, like somebody would kind of drag Larry out of the kitchen and make him put down the towel and stop doing everything and get a picture of him and my mother. My mother would be in all the rest of the pictures with all of her guests. So that was my day-to-day experience of what I saw adult men doing. My grandfather was still alive. I saw him once a week. I mean, we visited regularly, but he wasn't that kind of a presence in my life. What I really saw was Larry. But what I got in the culture in the early 80s here, mid 80s, I am the first generation that grew up with so-called sex comedy movies. I actually, from Porky's to American Pie, that genre has really been killed off by streaming porn. Like I remember sneaking in to see the movie Porky's in the movie theater, and it was kind of revolutionary for me. And like, oh my god, and this real focus on sex. On the movies I was allowed to go see, a lot of violent action movies, right? My generation saw Rambo, First Blood. We had all of those Schwarzenegger films, Jean-Claude Van Damme, the whole Death Wish series with Charles Bronson, right? And again, like knowing as an adult now and as a researcher, knowing the history, those action films were done very differently than the action films in, say, the 70s or 60s, right? We have the kind of war movies coming out in the 50s and 60s, World War II. For the most part, somebody gets shot once, they die. We might or might not see a little blood on screen. The action characters themselves have a very clear chain of command, right? They're being given orders, they're hunting down the bad guys. We get to these movies in the 80s, and that kind of goes away, right? Stallone's character in Rambo, right? It's this shady black ops kind of stuff, which has now become commonplace in our movies.
Do you think, looking at both the sex comedies and these action films, and I was in those, I was in my version of those movie theaters in New York. You were down in the Philadelphia area. Did you feel like it permeated you and your male friends in some way? Was there a way for you to identify directly with how that defined masculinity in your childhood years?
So what I got, and we didn't really, I don't remember explicit conversations, but we all kind of understood there in the Reagan years that as American men, like we were supposed to be tough. We got it that we were supposed to want women and really just want sex from women. I was a nerd and classic nerd, right? Like I have the PhD now, but back in the day there, I was in the chess club, I was on the math team, I was playing first generation D&D, like before D&D was a cool thing. I had a computer before any of the teachers in my high school had computers, except for the computer teacher. Possibly before my principal had a computer, right? So like classic nerd. So for me, the identification was much more with films like Revenge of the Nerds, which, ultimately gets us to the Big Bang Theory more recently.
Right.
My identification was wanting to be the cool guy who could get laid, but really just being the guy that got made fun of. Although I didn't actually get made fun of, but
Hmm.
but I was more like those nerdy guys.
Did being the person that you were, having a focus on things like computers, did it feel like you fit into a hierarchy in school with other boys?
Oh, absolutely. And I was at the low end of that hierarchy. I was not so far down that I got bullied particularly. But part of that is that I was also in the gifted program, more nerd crowd there. Um, and in some ways, at least in my high school growing up, and it was a fairly well-off white suburban Philadelphia suburb high school, I think being segregated helped me in a lot of ways. I didn't have many classes with the kids who were bullies, right? I just saw them for, gym and art and those kinds of electives. But I wasn't, in a lot of ways, I wasn't around them enough to become a target. And then I had a job after school. Again, youngest child of a single mom in the 70s. We did not have money, even though we lived in a nice school district. Um, and I think, again, in some ways that protected me because I wasn't available, but it also helped me make friends with some other kids from my high school that I wasn't friends with from school because I didn't see them in class, but I did see them, 20, 30 hours a week, working retail.
You and I had a similar childhood game that we played, Kill the Guy with the Football.
Yes. Yes.
And I remember it so clearly. It was the challenge to me. I was always either average or slightly above average in terms of height and weight in my male class. And whenever we played Kill the Guy with the Football, I would take pride on carrying 3 or 4 guys on my shoulders before they would finally figure out a way to tackle me to the ground. It was one way for me to demonstrate I'm a tough guy, I'm
Yep.
masculine.
Yep.
But you said that Kill the Guy with the Football sort of transformed over time. And let's talk a little bit about how perhaps that relates to what you were learning about masculinity.
Sure. So the other name we had for Kill the Guy with the Ball, and it is a very inappropriate name, at least now, not so much then in the 80s, was Smear the Queer,
Mm-hmm.
right? And again, like for context, this is the early 80s. We're in the middle of the HIV crisis. And for parts of this, it's when the disease first becomes public and first gets identified, it was called GRID. It was gay related immune disorder. So
Mm-hmm.
we explicitly had the name of the people that were suffering in there. There was a lot of homophobia. Homophobia was not just kind of expected of boys, but it was still normative in the culture. And so, Smear the Queer, right? Very clear message there that you don't want to be the guy getting tackled by everyone. And certainly in the larger context, you don't want to be gay because, according to some of the preachers on TV, this was God's vengeance, this disease. And,
Right.
and they died by the millions.
It's quite a burden for boys to carry at such an early age with such, well, I mean, all of us were kind of scrawny and until maybe the high school years where we would start to bulk up. I remember a couple of guys who were big in junior high school and middle school, but most of us were, 100
Right.
and teen pounds. To carry that and to have to demonstrate sort of this manly hierarchy feels very familiar to me going back to movies, to The
Mm-hmm.
Breakfast Club, and what
Sure.
one of the characters went through. Tell us about one of the more profound characters in The Breakfast Club and how this relates to what a young man goes through in trying to front an image that may not actually be who he is inside.
Sure. And Breakfast Club, not only a classic 80s movie, but generating my prom song there. Don't You Forget About Me. It's a lovely sentiment. It's a great song. You can't dance to it. It's mid-speed. It doesn't work. Um, but I suspect you're talking about the wrestler played by, who is that? Emilio Estevez. The character's name is
Yep.
Andrew, just like me. Um, And one of the amazing things about the film is it starts off with presenting the kids as their stereotype: the jock, the rebel, the nerd, the uptown girl, and the basket case, the princess in the basket case. And then over the course of the 90 minutes of the movie, we get to see behind the stereotypes or behind the mask, right? They all kind of play into these roles and they slowly open up. Um, the jock, the wrestler there, played by Emilio Estevez, right? Like the scene where he breaks down, he talks about needing to impress his dad, and his dad will only accept him if he's excellent, and he's got to be the number one wrestler and win all his matches. And he's in the locker room at the end of gym class, and he goes off on the fat, nerdy kid. And as he's telling the story to his classmates there, like he starts to cry and talks about the pressure of living up to this his dad's expectation of him and not feeling like he has a choice, like he just has to do this because it's the only way that he can make his dad happy or make his dad proud of him. Um, and so, I think a lot of us get that as boys. There is this cultural image that we're supposed to live up to. We're supposed to be big. We're supposed to be tough. In case of emergency, it's, women and children first, and the guys stay till the end, possibly fight off the bad guys. I can't tell you how many women I've walked to their cars over the years as we're, leaving some bar or some club. Not like I had any experience in fighting. Like I understood at 20 that like my job was to take the bullet or the punch and hope that they were fast, the women were fast enough to get away. I had
Right.
no pretense there about my own abilities in this fight. We get the image really starting in the 70s and the 80s that we're supposed to be sexually promiscuous. We get the image, and I certainly got this from my stepfather, but also, the times that I grew up in, we're supposed to be the primary earner, possibly the only earner, right? As we, folks talk about trad wives today, and who is it that wants a trad wife? It's a guy who sees himself as the only, as the provider. He's the only earner in the family, right? And it's all there in the culture. As teenagers, we pick some of it up and try it on. We drop some of it we keep. Some of it gets, reinforced by the folks around us. One of not one of the questions, as a child growing up in the 70s, and I hear this today, I still do it sometimes today, right? The question that I was taught to ask a man when I meet him for the first time is, what do you do for a living? Right? Not what do you do for money? What's your job? What do you do for a living? Right? And we conflate work and life in that sentence. And we teach people, both the person who's asking the question, the person who's receiving that question, that the most important thing about a man is how he earns money. It's not his family, it's not his hobbies. And so all that comes together as we try on these roles, as we figure out as individual people if we can fit the stereotype or not.
One of the characters in the Breakfast Club is also, I guess they called him the dirtbag, John Bender, the Judd Nelson character.
Right. Criminal.
And one of the images that he carries into that room is that he's having sex like crazy with, all of the girls in the school. You've studied the data. How
Mm-hmm.
much of Bender's image and how much we think about boys as being these, polygamous, orgasm seeking, testosterone engines, how much of that is true?
So that image is true, but it only represents a small percentage of guys. This was the focus of my first book, Challenging Casanova, Beyond the Stereotype of the Promiscuous Young Male. And I read a lot of research by psychologists who study sex, but also folks who are looking at birth control and teen pregnancy or preventing teen pregnancy, looking at preventing disease transmission, STIs. And what we consistently see is that the more detailed you get about the question, the smaller the numbers get. So there are these folks out there, in particular David Buss and David Schmidt, who identify as evolutionary psychologists who have proposed something called sexual strategy theory, SST. And they argue that, the historical data and divorce rates and all that argue that men are really just interested in sex, and it's all about short-term mating strategies. Their data, so their favorite question to ask is, how many sexual partners would you like to have in the next 30 days? David Schmidt in particular headed what is a truly amazing research study. He put together a team from all around the world. They surveyed folks in 54 different countries, nations, islands, whatever, truly a global sample. Most of the people they surveyed were college students. And overall, and here in the US, what they found is that about 20% of young men say that they want 2 or more partners in the next 30 days. And this is compared to about 6% of women. So, right, huge difference between young men and young women, 25% versus 6%. But that's only 25% of young men saying they want 2 or more partners in the next 30 days. It means the other guys, 75%, are saying they want either 0 partners or 1 partner in the next 30 days. Where I come from, 75% is a lot more than 25%. If 75% of the people vote for you, you win the election. 25% of the people vote for you, you don't, you lose. If you win 75% of your games in your sports league, you're going to the playoffs. You're probably the best team in the league. 25%, you're probably on the other end of that.
With a really good draft choice.
That's right. You get a really good draft choice for that. Right. And that's just asking guys what they want. Right? How many partners do you want in the next 30 days? If you look at the folks who are doing research and asking people how many partners they've actually had in the last year, right? So we've shifted from how many partners do you want? And then the next 30 days, how many partners have you had in the last 12 months? Somewhere around 15% of guys tell us that they've had 3 or more sexual partners in the last year. And these are typically samples 18 to 29. Sometimes they're college-based, sometimes they're out in the community. But 15%, that's about 1 guy in 7 saying that he's had 3 or more partners in the last year. And when you take it even farther, if you can track those guys year after year after year, even just for 3 years, there's not very many studies that do that, the number drops to about 5% of guys who have had 3 or more partners for 3 consecutive years. So while we have this image that guys just want sex, that we all just want to hook up, the reality is that the vast majority of guys don't actually want to have multiple sex partners in the next 30 days. And the vast majority of guys are not having 3 or more partners in a year, let alone year after year after year. And that's what the data tell us.
You moved away from home about 400 miles when you went to college. You joined a fraternity. Did you see this data lining up with your experience as a college student surrounded by boys in an environment where parties and girls were readily available?
Yes, absolutely. We hosted a party every other week in my fraternity. We were a small fraternity, about 15 or 20 brothers. I'm going to use bad language here, but I don't have to worry about the FCC. Like, we all talked shit. If you talk to us on Friday afternoon, right, all the guys who didn't have a steady partner, like, we're all going to get laid at the party. We're all gonna find the woman and bring her home and all that. out of the 15 or 20 of us, across the couple of years that I was in the fraternity, there were really only two guys who were trying to get laid most weeks. But we all talked shit. Like none of us would sit in that, hang around as we're getting the house ready. Nobody was like, yeah, no, I'm not trying to get laid today, or I don't want to do that anymore. Like we all claim to have game here. But most of us weren't doing that. So, two guys out of 15 or 20, take that as about 1 in 10, 10%, maybe a little bit more, maybe 15%. That tracks with the data.
So you've not only had your own personal experience having male friends in a college environment, you've been studying the data. Now you're actually working with boys who are in an environment where they're trying to open up to someone, and you've been chosen as a therapist. What are these myths that we've just talked about? The toughness, the sexual animal, what do they look like in the boys that you're working with in terms of myths and realities about masculinity?
Sure, that's a great question. Um, I will say, I'll do the shameless plug here. I go through a lot of this in the newest book, Clinical Work with Men, Understanding Masculinity in Psychotherapy. So I have 7 case studies, including one on a player, as we would call the promiscuous guys today, or playa. I'm not cool enough to actually say that without generating laughter, but also the provider, the protector, the unemotional man. Um, the teenagers, the young guys I work with, 15 to 29, but even some of the adults, some of the guys around my age talk about, well, this is just what I'm supposed to be because I'm a guy. Um, I profile one guy who's a player in the book. It's one of the case studies. So John had been very promiscuous, often between relationships. He tried to be very diligent about not cheating on his partners, because he believed that when you're in a committed relationship, you commit and you don't do that. And he had also been burned more than once by a partner who cheated on him. And he was self-aware enough that he did not want to be hypocritical. So he was very diligent about not cheating. Um, but part of the conversation we had over the months and years that I worked with him was about why he chose to be promiscuous and why he would find partner after partner but not stay with them. Um, and we recognized that he has what's called an anxious attachment style. Um, and that what he's really looking for is someone to connect with, someone that would feel like to him like they really had his back, they knew him, they understood him, they would support him. And what sexual intimacy provides is a real moment of intense connection, right? And when we're with somebody, whether they're an ongoing partner or somebody that's just one night, right, like we get some of that connection, and in some ways it would really kind of calm him down and make him feel not anxious, comfortable. Not all guys who are anxiously attached do that. There are guys who are securely attached who do that. But for him, that was how it played out. And, there are ways in which he leaned into the stereotype. Like he figured this out at 17, 18, that he was good with women, right? He could talk, he could make them comfortable. He could score in the lingo there. Um, and that it felt good, not just physically, but emotionally. And so, again, when he was between regular partners, he would sometimes sleep around.
So, over time, both in seeing patients like John, reflecting on your life as a boy and then a man, you've eventually come around to a framework that demonstrates the multifaceted ways that men approach masculinity.
Thank you for asking. So, not just through my own lived experience, but also through reading a ridiculous amount of literature on my way to getting the PhD. I discovered that as researchers, they have conceptualized masculinity in a couple of different ways. And as I was sitting down to write clinical work with men, I knew that I was going to need a chapter where I explained what masculinity is and how it works. Because for me, writing this book is a lot of that is an effort to help men, but it's also an effort to help our heavily female dominated field learn to be culturally competent in working with men. And I knew that if I was writing for mostly a female audience of therapists, I was going to need to explain masculinity. So, as I was thinking about the different approaches to masculinity that have been developed and researched over the years, I decided that I wasn't going to pick one, I was going to pick all of them and find a way to make them all make sense together. And so that was how I came around to developing the multifaceted masculinity framework. I was fortunate enough to be able to publish that as a peer-reviewed article. In the process of writing the book gets a less technical version of that. But what we've researched, and it certainly fits with my personal experience, my experience as a clinician, is that there's really these four different facets of masculinity that guys incorporate and at some level think about, or at least wrestle with. One of these is masculine criteria, right? These are the things that a guy should do or should not do, right? Like we should be tough, we should not act like women, right? We should not be scared, we should not lose our cool, we should not show emotion. We should be ready to defend people. We should be earners. In the research, we talk about measuring masculine traits or masculine ideology. In everyday language, we talk about a man card or the man box, right? So we know about these in the culture. What we don't always pay attention to in the culture is the way that these change over time, or the ways that these might contradict each other. Right? Guys are supposed to be, right? If you're a guy and you're doing something, you should give it your all. You should be the best possible. But then, like, not at school because school is feminine. So, like that, those contradict each other. So that's masculine criteria. We also have masculine types, right? These are images or identities or stereotypes about men that give adolescents and adults these culturally sanctioned, predefined ways to be a man. Some of these have more status, some of these have less status, but right, we could be the jock, like Andrew in the Breakfast Club. We can be the rebel. We can be the nerd, right? And it's again, these things exist in the culture. They're readily identifiable. We see them all the time. Certainly, if you're on the dating apps, you see people describing themselves with these terms all the time. Right? And that's certainly not unique to men. So we have masculine criteria, we have masculine types. The next piece of this is masculine achievement. This is the third facet that I'm talking about here. Masculine achievement refers to the status you get for adhering to those criteria or adhering to a type and doing it well. Right? We talk about guys being man enough, or if you're doing it really well, maybe you're a real man or even the man. And we also talk about guys failing as men, right? And that means you're not doing it well. Or maybe you've picked something that's kind of low status, like being a nerd. Or maybe being a nerd picks you. Certainly how it felt like it for me. I mean, grow up and say, oh, I want to be a nerd. I just recognize myself in that stereotype. So that's masculine achievement. And, we have research on that. Social psychologists Joseph Bandello and Jennifer Bosson developed a paradigm called precarious manhood. They're about 15 years into that research now, maybe 20. And one of the things they point out, it's the title of probably their most famous article, is that manhood is hard won and easily lost. Right? You have to prove it. You have to prove it. You have to prove it. And then you mess up one day and you've lost it, and you got to kind of start over.
Right.
Other folks, my friend and colleague Christopher Regaluth, author of the Masculinity Workbook for Teen Boys, he talks about the ways that and studies the ways that particularly teenagers, police masculinity and kind of enforce the boys or force boys to stay on stereotype. So we have masculine criteria, masculine types, masculine achievement, which is the status. And then the fourth facet here is masculine negotiations. And these are the negotiations, the conversations that guys kind of have with themselves in their head about, and maybe sometimes with other folks, about what kind of man do I want to be, or recognizing like, oh, I seem to fit this type, but maybe I want to go in some other direction, right? And what am I good at? Like, you apparently hit your growth spurt on the earlier side. Not me. I was among the last. So I was scrawny and kind of average height until like junior or senior year. I ultimately became a 6 footer. I filled out a little bit, but that came late for me. Dreams of jockness died early. Um,
When the dreams died, how did that impact your ability to feel masculine? Did it feel like that was something you felt you could have achieved, earned? And did it make being a boy harder because now you had to go find something else to be not the nerd?
so that one died pretty young. Like I was 7 or 8. There were a lot of us in the apartment complex where I grew up, at least until we moved just before I turned 10. Like I was not, I'm not even going to say I was not the most athletic kid. I was not a particularly athletic kid. Aside from being one of the youngest and therefore smallest, like, among those kids in the apartment complex, I was in gym class when we picked teams. Like I was usually about third from last. I wasn't quite last, but I was pretty far down the list. The idea that I was going to grow up and be a hockey player was always kind of far fetched. There, it died pretty easily. Um,
It it died easily, but the whole concept of males and sports can be a powerful uplifter for a guy. Did you find that you reached for other things to replace this thing that you couldn't aspire to for practical reasons?
um, I did not, and part of that was being a smart kid, ultimately being in the gifted track. Like there were other things that I did where I felt competent. I developed self-confidence. I developed the awareness that I could, do well and gain approval from others. And again, being in a gifted program, like I was tracked into that. So I didn't have to deal with all of the other kids in school, including the kids
Right.
who might shit on that. But, and I work with kids, some of the teenagers I work with, some of the adults I work with, right? They talk about, going through school and never really finding anything that they were good at. Like they were fine students, they'd be averages. Maybe they managed to make the cut and get onto a team, but they were never a starter and they were certainly never the star. They weren't particularly musical, so like they weren't in a band and being cool like that. And with the teenagers, with the adults, we talk about, how did you find your way, or how will you find your way, and what are you good at, or what are you really interested in that you might want to develop, where you could have, something that's at least, something that is hopefully very good, perhaps exceptional, perhaps not. Most of us are not, by definition, exceptional. Um, so, I had something else that could anchor my identity pretty quickly. But plenty of folks do
So
not, and they just kind of float through.
so let's relate this, back to John. Um,
Mm-hmm.
what happens when a man lives inside a flattened version of masculinity? How does he ever leave that version? And did John ever figure out how to be masculine or feel like a man without having to perform certain behaviors that perhaps were not aligned with his own virtue.
So John did figure it out, and actually part of the reason that he came to therapy was that he was really struggling with these kinds of issues and asking, why do I do this? Why do I keep trying to, why do I keep jumping into bed quickly with all these women when it's not satisfying? He was doing all right in his career when I met him. And one of the things that happened in therapy was he said, I really like my job and I want to advance. But he was kind of frozen out just based on his education and training. And he ultimately went back to school, and school presented him, got an advanced degree, and school gave him an intellectual challenge that actually was much more fulfilling than the challenge of hooking up with random women. And John thrives on a challenge. And the new career path is one that gives him challenges on the regular. So, that works for him and it fits his psyche, right? There's this kind of competitive piece that he's got, and he can now exercise that at work. And he doesn't need to exercise that in the bar or in the club, which allows him to really focus on finding the woman that he wants, because he also wants a long-term partner, somebody to settle down with and get married and raise kids. And now when when he meets a woman and he's thinking about, is she right for me? He can really think about, does she have the characteristics that he wants in a long-term partner? And not just, is she somebody that I can, masturbate into this evening?
Andrew, given your extensive experience working with other therapists, the amount of literature that you read, you're also a consumer of pop culture. So you're quite aware of how masculinity is portrayed in society, and also how people who are immersed in trying to understand gender and gender behaviors. Or does John's story come across as a shock to the people that you talk to in your field? Do they understand this as an anomaly, or do they say, no, that's probably most men's experience in life?
All right, that's a great question. I think a lot of the therapists I talk to who are relatively young and just starting out as therapists, I think they are more likely to be surprised when I talk about a guy like John, and he wants to be more than this stereotype, and he really is more than this stereotype. But when I talk to therapists who've been doing this for, 7, 8, 10 years, 20, 30, they're not really surprised. One of the things about being a therapist is you meet a lot of people and you see and you hear a lot of stories, and our job is to get to know our clients in great detail.
Go ahead.
And again, that's part of the reason that I think we need to be teaching therapists to be culturally competent with men, because the reality of men's lives is very different than these stereotypes that we've been talking about. And exposing soon-to-be therapists to that during their education would move them along faster and allow them to be better therapists with their male clients.
So as we start to wrap things up, and I'm hoping this is the beginning of a long and fruitful professional relationship, is what do you think are the biggest obstacles to our being able to expand both to men directly, but to society more broadly, this concept that men and masculinity is multifaceted, that it changes over time, and that most men, I'm thinking the research shows, actually want to move towards a more expansive identity of manhood? What's holding us back, and what do you think are some of the measures we need to take to give people that opportunity to drop some of these myths and to flatten the man box?
Wow, that's a great question. For me, the big thing that holds us back is this cultural idea that men are simple, that we all want the same things or should want the same things, right? That we all want to have multiple sexual partners, as you and I have talked about, that we all just want to be rich, that, we are all content serving as protectors. Um, we don't know our own history when it comes to masculinity. We tend to think that, again, we have this very simple notion that masculinity is inborn. It's somehow related to the Y chromosome or testosterone. We forget that all humans have testosterone. Women have it too, and just have a higher dose. And we all know a range of men, right? If you're watching some kind of TV news show with the commentator sitting there and spouting off, we all understand that, maybe that person is male. We kind of forget that the guys who are working the cameras, or the people who are working the cameras, probably also men. The showrunner or some production assistant or whatever, probably some guys there, some guys in the technical booth doing production stuff, right? Like that guy who's the host, whether we're talking about somebody like Jon Stewart or Sean Hannity, right? He doesn't show up at work every day wondering if some of those other men are going to kill him and try to take his job, right? There's plenty of guys that don't want to be the big fish, that are content to just do their piece. But we somehow forget that or ignore that, right? We see a dad with his young child in the mall and no woman around, and we think, wow, he's amazing. No, he's just being a dad. There should not be anything special about that. But
Yes.
and when we go up to him and say, like, oh my God, you're such a good dad, because he's just shown up, right? He's done kind of the minimum possible. You're like, what does that say about our expectations and our culture's expectations? And I think the big challenge is that we tell everybody that men are simple. And the reality is that they're not. We're very complicated. But the first thing that we need to do is convince people that we're not simple.
Right.
And who wants to do that other than me and you, apparently?
I would agree. I think most of the dialogue today, especially because social media algorithms are designed to promote simplicity, polarity, an easy way to comprehend something, and hopefully in a way that either agitates you or brings you into the tribe. It's one of the two. And as a result, it's just so much easier to portray both men and women, because I see it done to women as well, just to portray this simplistic notion. I'm a big advocate of dads, and whenever I'm out at a coffee shop or a playground and I see a dad, I don't do what you just said. I don't go and say, wow, how great. What I will do is go over and say, this is a really special moment, and watching the two of you has been wonderful, because here I am, 61 years old. My youngest is 23. Those days are far behind me. And I say to the guys, do you mind if I take a picture of you and your child with your phone so that you have this? And every single one of them say, their eyes open wide and they say yes, because they do realize that this is something they want to treasure, but that they're there present in the moment, and they're grateful someone both noticed and that someone wants to help them remember it, because we all know those moments go by so fast. That to me has always spoken to the complexity of men, is that they're never caught off guard. They're never saying dopey things. They're genuinely grateful that another man has said to them, I just want you to capture this moment.
That's great.
And to me, that's a tremendous amount of emotional depth.
Yeah, I'm totally stealing that. That's awesome.
Andrew, we have got so much more to talk to, but you've got a hockey game to watch. I've got some additional work to do. If you could leave us with one piece of advice for men who are struggling to get past this narrative, this myth, if you were to say to them, this is why so many men don't leave, what would that thing be?
Sorry, this is why so many men don't leave.
Leave the box of the
Leave the
man
box.
box.
Okay, thank you. I would say I would encourage guys to remember that men are complicated. We used to value that much more than we do. We could change that.
Mm-hmm.
And in lots of ways, being complicated is a good thing. And we should not, I don't believe that we should have to hide the fact that we're complicated. Um, so that's, said differently, it's really what I was taught as a young child, like be yourself, right? You don't have to live up to other people's expectations or stereotypes. Just be you. No one else will.
And as you earlier stated, we are all complex, and the MFMF points to the four major factors that create that complication. It's our psychological makeup, it's the community we grow up in, it's the norms that we're told about, and it's our family of origin. All of those forces create such complexity in each one of us because not all of us go through any of those experiences the same way. Therefore, of course, we're all different and complex in
Right.
our own
And
unique
then,
way.
right. And also complicated by, where and when we're living, right? I live in a medium-sized city. I work with clients who live in rural areas and have always lived in rural areas. And those are very different experiences.
Yeah.
Certainly different for me in my 50s than for some of those guys in their teens and 20s.
And it changes over your lifetime. Absolutely. I know that
Yeah,
I've changed dramatically as a man, especially after I became a father. I mean, I think I was always something of a
absolutely.
sensitive person, but once I held my daughter, my first child, for the first time, I was never going to be the same after that moment. It was something I dreamed about since I was 16 years old. And now I was
Wow.
actually living it and embodying fatherhood. And I could never turn back to a
Yeah.
simplistic Richard.
Yeah. Cool.
Andrew, thank you again so much for your time. Where can we find you online? And how easy is it to get your latest book?
You can find me online at andrewsmiler.com. Very simple, just my name there. Fortunate, I was the first one to claim it. I believe there's a barrister in London who might be annoyed about that. And you can find clinical work with men, understanding masculinity and psychotherapy at all the major booksellers. And if your local independent bookstore doesn't have it and you want to support them, ask them to order it. It might take you a few extra days, but it's important to keep those small businesses going.
Well, please continue the great work that you're doing. We so desperately need it. I see it across society. It's not just for the benefit of men. It's for everybody, boys, girls, and women. All of us need the work that you're doing, and we're very grateful for it.
Thank you much. I appreciate it.